Hello and welcome. This is Camille Fairborn from Michigan State University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Cause Teaching and Learning webinar. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Green as our presenter today. She is an Associate Professor of Statistics at Montana State University, and for today's webinar, she will give a presentation entitled The Art of Storytelling, Enhancing Graduate Students' Oral Communication Skills. The way the webinars work is that all listeners are muted during the webinar. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the questions box. We'll be sure to ask those questions towards the end and give our presenter a chance to respond. You can also use the chat box if you're having any technical questions. So at this point, I'll turn things over to our presenter. Jenny, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Camille. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to get the chance to share the work that we're doing with our graduate students and helping prepare them to speak with a lot of different audiences, including the general public. And so you can see all my colleagues and I and the work that we're doing, we're going to get to talk about today here. So to start off, I want everyone to just think for a little bit about your latest research project. And if you want to talk to yourself, you may, but how would you describe that research project to a colleague? What would you say? All right, and now switching gears, let's say that you were talking about that same research project, but instead needed to talk about it to an airplane acquaintance. In that particular situation, what would you choose to include? How would you decide what to say and how to say it? And in a lot of our work with the students, we're thinking about audience and underlying how important it is to think about what sort of ways we might translate what we're saying and what's most important to say based on whom we're speaking with and having a conversation with. So here is an example of how a student chose to go ahead and summarize their research for a general scientific audience. And this word cloud is summarizing the words that were used throughout that audio recording. The words that are largest are those that were used more frequently, and then the ones you can see that are smaller aren't used as often. And we can see that the student made choices about what words they thought a general scientific audience might relate to, but it does beg the question, do we know what SOFCs are? If we're not in engineering, maybe not. And so throughout all of this work, just highlighting, well, in general, as graduate students, we really don't get a lot of practice thinking about, well, maybe this wasn't the best translation, or maybe this is an effective translation. How do I think through that? And why don't we learn it? Well, if we think about our graduate training for a standard statistician, right, and our scientists in general, we take coursework, we conduct research, maybe even we participate in consulting or get the opportunity to teach statistics or another subject to students. But a lot of times we're sharing our content and research with others that are wanting to learn the specifics of our discipline and not necessarily having to engage with a general audience or general public about that work. And this is true about graduate students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics related fields in general. A lot of times they don't get formal communication training that's needed to easily share their work with others and creates or perpetuates this gap that we have in communication with others. I hope that you're asking, well, why is that important? Well, it's important, especially in statistics and data science, where our field is at the forefront of a lot of conversations through the media and often faces quite a bit of scrutiny. And if we're able to communicate our discipline and the work that we're doing in a manner that others are able to understand, there's an opportunity for us to build trust, but to also engage them in that work and get excited about it and support it. I also think that it's important and that we have a responsibility really as scientists to be able to share what we're doing with anyone and everyone just to help bridge this communication gap that often exists between the scientific community and the public. A team of us, you can see my colleagues and I, really beg the question, well, how can we do this? how can we provide formal training for students to help prepare them for this important task that we see needed in the future? And the way that we chose to do that was to go ahead and have a year-long set of workshops where each week we meet for an hour and a half and we talk about a lot of different topics. So, for example, in the fall, the workshops really center around this idea of podcasting. And you can see the list of different assignments that the students had and had the opportunity to record using podcasting so that they could continue and develop their skills as speakers and sharing their research with others on how to craft stories. In the spring, our workshop has really shifted attention now to thinking about how we might present our research. And in particular, the students are preparing for a 10-minute oral presentation with the public at what we're calling curiosity cafes. And what's documented here is this progression of how they're transitioning, of identifying what's most important about their research, how they might use metaphors to enhance audience understanding, and then how they might craft their presentation, including slides and/or using body language to help engage the audience. A novel element and way that we have helped support the students throughout all of these workshops is through using improvisation. By developing their improvisational skills and weaving this throughout the entire set of workshops, we're really helping students normalize the stress and vulnerability that comes from being put on the spot. It also gives them a chance to actively listen to what their audience is saying. It's not a matter of us having a canned speech that we then share with others, but instead us engaging in a conversation where we really need to listen what the audience is saying so that we can adapt in the moment as needed. And developing those improvisational skills really help us to do that. So, for example, today, we just got out of a workshop this morning, and the students had an opportunity to give the infamous 1-minute elevator speech about their research. And they were supposed to assume that the person they were talking to really didn't have any understanding of their particular discipline or subject area. And what was interesting is while this is a task most of us have prepared for and maybe even have tucked away in the back of our mind when preparing for a job application or job interview, it really evolved in a different way by thinking about improvisation. So instead of having that canned speech, the students were charged to think about, well, what might be an interesting way to engage in a conversation and offer a nugget of information that then allows the person that we're talking to ask a question and really guide the direction of the discussion as opposed to just sharing our 1-minute spiel and having it be one-sided. And so adding this element really helps develop the student skills to be adaptable and flexible in the moment and really give a meaningful talk to who they're speaking to. Our primary learning goals all start with C's, for we like alliteration. But the first one that we really want to impress upon the students and talk about throughout the whole year is thinking about how we might cultivate connection with our audience. And so through the example of the elevator speech, we can see, right, that was really coming out when thinking about what the person we're speaking to might ask or request for additional information. We also want to be able to captivate the audience. In other words, crafting an engaging narrative and presenting an engaged presence so that our audience wants to listen to what we have to say. And this is all for the ultimate goal, right, of being able to convey what it is we're saying and why it's important so that what we share or the content that we share is clear, accurate, and compelling for our audience and helping us ultimately tell a better story. So here is just a moment where I want you to go ahead and reflect back to your favorite, most memorable talk that someone gave. When thinking about that talk, how did the particular speaker embed some of those elements? Like, how did they captivate your attention and connect with you in a way to help convey what message it was that they wanted to speak. Hopefully, you thought of some of the different elements that we'll be sharing in just a little bit, but the key part of this reflection is just to remember and keep in mind that good stories help us care and build relationships by connecting us to the storyteller and to what the stories are about. It's no question, we're all doing critically important work, but the question is, how do we communicate it effectively to others? And we can use the elements of storytelling to help us do that. So one way we might do this is to break away from the traditional norm that we're so used to seeing at research conferences, where perhaps someone might give an outline of what they're planning to speak about and then go ahead and progress through the research from beginning to end in a way that we might write about it, for example, in a manuscript. But that isn't always effective for every single audience to grab their attention and to help them understand what you're trying to say. So instead, maybe we might think about reordering the different elements or ways that we share that information. Maybe we start with a conclusion. Maybe we add an element of suspense or surprise to keep people on their edges and alert to pay attention to us. But even with all of this mixing up, I think it's really important to keep in mind that great stories have to have a clear structure and purpose, building up to some sort of climax and communicating why that work is important while maintaining a clear focus on the main takeaway message. Like, why should we care and what should we take away from this particular talk? So I don't know about you all, but I know that when I have a story and I'm talking about my work, I want to tell the whole story, details and all, but parsing it down to what's most important can really help us better convey and communicate what it is that we want to share with our audience and what's so important. So here's an example of a student's work. So this is a podcast that the student created in a word cloud to represent what the student said in that podcast. And for this particular assignment, the student was supposed to create a podcast or a recording that used the language and structure of an article, an open access article that she had chosen. And she could use the language that was used in the particular paper itself, but the idea was to create this short narrative that explained the major points of what the paper was about and promoted understanding of the particular concepts. And so we can see a lot of different ideas going on here. In a second recording, the student was then asked to translate that information into layperson language while attempting to cover the same concepts. So you can see the stark contrast between these two different recordings and how in the first one, right, there was a lot of different conversation about conservation and areas and conflict and lions, but in the second podcast, the student really chose to focus on the core idea, the idea that lions, right, are important and are at risk. And so this example hopefully helps convey how important this idea of translation is. And answering some different questions, for example, what does our audience really need to know? That depends on what audience we're talking to. And then also, why should they care? That also depends on what audience we're talking to. And so when thinking about giving a talk, like for example, when I was giving this webinar, when I thought about what I was going to share, well, I really thought about my audience and thought that you all might want to know what exactly it is we do in these workshops, as opposed to just talking about how we might better speak with the public. So when doing that, right, we want to think about what words, what images, and what stories are going to be most functional at achieving deeper understanding in whatever or with whatever particular audience we're telling the story to right now. And it doesn't mean dumbing it down. So I think that that often is a common conception that in particular students and maybe even ourselves have when we're thinking about talking with the general public or others outside of our discipline, or maybe even others within our own discipline. But really at the heart of all of this is to think and behave as if maybe our listeners don't know anything, but are capable of understanding everything. And this is something that can even translate to the classroom in general as when we're teaching statistics, and is really a core idea that I embrace and think is really important when we're trying to help others learn about what we do. Going back to those Lion podcasts here, we can see how that student chose to translate information for this general or lay audience that she was preparing for in the podcast. So in the first podcast, she had talked about how accelerating declines of carnivores as a result of human-carnivore conflict and habitat loss are likely. It's quite a mouthful. But then in the second translation, she really gets at the core with thinking about, well, people may be the bigger threat that lions face, and how important and striking that message is to the audience that she's speaking to. Another really important tool is to use analogy and metaphor. By identifying examples that help others connect to the value of our work and see how it connects to their own lives, it really portrays it or can lead to this deeper understanding. And we want to do that in an authentic way, right? That isn't deceiving and allows us still to maintain credibility. And so that can be incredibly challenging. With the Lion podcasts, here we see in that first podcast, the student was talking about how growth is expected to be highest near protected areas, but that might not mean a lot to other people who don't study this, or maybe even it might not mean a lot to other people who even research this. But by offering this extra information in the second podcast, the listeners are able to see, oh, well, this means that there would be a lot of growth, right? Human development that's going to be happening around Yellowstone and Yosemite National Parks, as opposed to, say, metropolitan areas like Chicago or maybe even New York. And how you can maybe see how in Montana that could be extremely meaningful, right? Given that we're so close to the Yellowstone National Park. A statistics student wanted to go ahead and convey the controversy surrounding p-values right now in the literature. And he was speaking to his fellow cohorts in the STEM Storytellers program that we have going on this year. And what he chose as a metaphor or as an analogy for them to relate to is he's saying, you know, scientists' enthusiasm and love of p-values is really similar to, say, someone being really excited to go out and buy a brand new shiny sports car. And how if that person really doesn't know how to use that car or how to drive it very well, it could be extremely dangerous and potentially problematic, right? If that person is driving really fast and loses control. And so by using those different examples, he was able to convey the importance surrounding the discussions that are happening around the use of p-values and within the scientific community. Another element that we talk a lot about throughout these workshops is how important delivery is. We need to be able to animate with our voices and use inflection. And this is particularly important when we're recording podcasts or maybe even webinars, for example, and the audience can't see us. Nonverbal communication is also important. It's not just what we say, but how we say it. Our facial expressions, our gesture, our posture, our eye contact, all of that can help enhance our conversations and make them even more engaging, whether in person or even over podcasts. You can better believe right now that I'm using my hand motions to speak with you all, because that's naturally what I would do if I was presenting with you in person. Visuals are also another important thing to consider, and thinking about how powerful they can be as opposed to, say, words. But the slides and pictures we choose really need to enhance our story and not serve as a crutch. And this is something that I continue to work on and think about. So some student examples that we have here. In this particular case, the student chose to draw a picture of a neighborhood to humanize this idea of microbial communities and a way that the audience might connect to what she was talking about. In another set of visuals, a student used this movement and these different slides to portray what she was meaning by this rest rotation cycle and how the cattle are moving to different areas of land across time and the land's being used in different ways. And I promise this isn't a glitch. I think, and this was so impactful to me, that a lot of times we depend so much on our slides when sometimes we don't need something up there. Really, it's a conversation between us and our audience. And so maybe it's also important to just have nothing up there so that the audience can look at us or look at the speaker and connect with them and have that conversation. Because it truly is, at the end of the day, or should be, a conversation as opposed to, that's two-sided as opposed to one-sided. So we're getting toward the end of this webinar, and just some really key takeaways that I hope come from this is the importance of providing this formal or even informal communication development for graduate students, but also ourselves. It's important for us to know our audience so that we can tell a better story that helps us connect with them and captivate their attention in order to convey what we think is most important for them to know about the work that we're doing. This process requires so much translation and thinking about how do I translate it for this specific audience? What do they need to know and why do they need to know it? Because even though they might not know it, they're capable of understanding everything if I can craft a clear enough message. And then finally, to not forget that even though it's important to have these improvisational skills, as a lot of us use in our own teaching with a classroom, we still have to practice. We still have to prepare. It doesn't mean we walk into the classroom without having a plan. It's just a willingness to adapt in the moment as needed. And then also to keep in mind that the work that we're doing, and by placing importance on all of this, really has broader impacts for everyone, not just our students, but also the public, and giving us a chance to share our findings in a way that they can understand and appreciate and hopefully help inform policy and other decisions that are really important. Throughout all of this work as well, as faculty members, we've participated in the weekly workshops, and I have benefited immensely from all of this work, personally and professionally. So, for example, just thinking about the simple use of saying yes and, as opposed to yes but, when somebody's contributing an idea, whether it be in the classroom or working with a graduate student that I'm advising, by building on and brainstorming research ideas and or teaching ideas and saying yes and, it really helps us develop fuller, richer ideas than saying yes but and shutting them down. It's always a work in progress for me, but thinking about and carefully choosing my slides so that they enhance my talk as opposed to serve as a crutch. A lot of times I like to use them as a guide to remind me what exactly it was I wanted to say. And so being intentional like that is continually a work in progress. And, you know, keeping in mind that all of this really is ongoing, that we're never going to be perfect, is definitely an art of storytelling. And how do we keep on honing and enhancing the skill? Because even if we can't have a program like this on our own campuses, we can still focus on developing and using these skills ourselves and helping mentor our students through that process to help bridge this communication. As you know, as statisticians, we're really used to telling stories of data. Let's extend this art of storytelling to break the traditional barriers that allow us to share the enthusiasm that we have and the value of our work with the whole world, not just one another. And so with that, if you'd like to learn more information, please feel free to check out our website that we have, including details about the application process. And you can see the picture of the first 2 cohorts of students that have participated in this program. And I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jenny, for this really interesting work that you're doing and for sharing with us today. Those of you who are attending, if you have any questions for Dr. Green, go ahead and type them in the questions box and I will pass those along to her. I notice you've got this grant here. How long do you anticipate being able to continue with this program at Montana State, or is this going to be an ongoing funded thing, or how's that working?
Yeah, that's a great question, Camille. So right now we are funded for 1 more year. So we plan to be able to support 3 cohorts of students, 3 different years of this program. And we're talking with the graduate dean and various other parties across campus because they see and value the importance of this work. And we want to think about how it can become more sustainable without needing to be supported by grant funding. We're also interested in thinking about collaborating with other institutions and thinking about how this might translate right to different environments and places and working with others in that capacity.
Right, I can see how that could really have an impact beyond just one university. Patricia's asking, when did you initially get the funding?
Oh my goodness, that is a great question. It was a few years ago. I have to bring that up to be exact. I want to say that it was a few years ago, but I'll have to look up here to know exactly the exact year. Sorry about that.
Rebecca's asking, how did you identify a faculty member who was an actor and author as well as the other faculty involved?
That's another great question. So Shannon Willoughby is the PI of the particular grant, and the actor and author is an adjunct faculty member on our campus. So we were really fortunate to have that relationship already present and that expertise available on our campus. And so Shannon ended up connecting the list of people that you saw on the first page of the slide and then later in pictures to bring us together so that she had STEM disciplinary experts in air quotes there, to be able to mentor the students and thinking about like, how does this apply to science? But then having the library sciences expert and then also the actor and author contribute novel ways of thinking about communication.
Yeah, I've always been really impressed with meeting with other colleagues across different disciplines, even not just in STEM, but across the campus, and hearing about how they teach. I think that we can all learn so much from each other. Well, thank you again, Jenny, for presenting this today, and thank you to everyone for attending. I know we have some more. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Camille. The year we received the award was in 2017.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't have that up in my head.
We have a lot of webinars scheduled for this spring, so I hope you'll keep your eyes on it and come back. And again, thanks to everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.